Good morning. I am Deborah Wright, one of the principals, along with my partner, Jim Kitchens of New Matrix. And we invite you to our Thursday Changing Church webinar. This, of course, is brought to you by a number of wonderful sponsors. Center for Healthy Churches, Matt Cook is our featured speaker today from them. Church Network, the Baptist News Global, the Truett Seminary and Truett Church Network, the Garner Webb Divinity School, Lake Institute for Faith and Giving, and the Presbyterian Foundation. We are headed off today into the land of history, and that's why that was enough to get me at 8 a.m. in California to get up, get showered, get dressed, and go on camera, because that's my field too. I'm one of those way overeducated in church history people. And Matt is going to carry us through to look at the notion of what I say sort of along the lines of Mark Twain's famous quote that history generally doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So we're going to look at church history through that sort of a lens. And Matt, with that, I think I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, everybody. And my thanks to Deborah for taking on the hosting responsibilities today. As Deborah said, my doctoral work is in church history, and I love it. And I have found myself oftentimes in the past 20 years of vocational ministry, looking back, when I find myself in the midst of uncertainty, as Deborah talked about with that Twain quote, I don't think history repeats itself, but I think there are valuable lessons in there for us to learn from. So for the next few weeks, that's kind of what we're going to be focused on. To get us started, though, I want to use a metaphor. I was privileged to spend last week up in Montana and Yellowstone, Wyoming, which is an amazing experience. Got to take my family with me, my wife and my two children, and my father-in-law and my mother-in-law went with us. And if you've been there, you know it's an amazingly beautiful place. You might also know it's a perilous place, or it can be a perilous place. There's a lot going on in Yellowstone. Part of what makes Yellowstone so interesting is what has taken place in the past and what's currently taking place beneath the surface. We were just talking a few moments ago, Jim Kitchens was joking about the super volcano beneath Yellowstone. And depending on which geologist you ask, we're either about 50,000 years overdue for a massive, massive volcanic eruption that could cover about 2/3 of North America, or we're about 150,000 years away from the next one. So, I guess we'll figure it out one way or the other, or people 150,000 years will figure it out one way or another. But that idea of a place of earthquakes and volcanoes and cataclysms and of challenges and difficulties and of peril, also being a place that is a seedbed for rich, wonderful diversity of life, is something that I want to kind of hold on to a little bit. I want to start with that metaphor in mind, and I want to end with that metaphor in mind. It's no shock or surprise to you to say that in the beginning of the 21st century, or this far into the 21st century, we face really, really interesting questions about just how healthy is the church. There was actually an article in the Wall Street Journal this very week asking and answering that very question. My mother-in-law sent me this morning. She's a very pro-religion person, and she said, "Hey, doesn't sound like church is doing it quite as bad as some people thought." And my response back to her was, "It's complicated." And the truth is, and I get a lot of this from one of our former panelists, a guy by the name of Dr. Ryan Burge, who talks about the fact that simultaneously there are some segments of the American population that are becoming more religious and others that are becoming far less so. What we can say, though, with a high degree of reliability is that all of the institutional measures for American Christianity are lower than they were in our parents' and our grandparents' generation. There's enough aggregate knowledge to know that that's true. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. But more importantly, given that the fact that that's our context, what might we learn from some other moments in the history of the people of God that might shed some light on us about how to respond to all that? So I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation with you this morning, and to kind of take us through that. All right. So the little title of my presentation this morning is "Of Churches and Earthquakes: What History Has to Teach Us About Renewing the Church." So what I was describing just a couple of minutes ago could probably be described in sociological terms as a religious earthquake. You've probably heard the oft-quoted statistic that 90% of churches in the United States are plateaued or in decline. And of the remaining 10%, 90% of those churches are only growing because of the Walmart effect. Walmart grew for so fast for so long because so many small mom and pop stores closed down. Well, so many of the mega churches are growing in American life because they're pulling in people from smaller churches. Only about 1% of American churches are growing by pulling in people who are not connected to a life of faith. That's a big difference in the 21st century versus the 20th century and the 19th century. 4,000 churches close their doors every year. We're still kind of putting our eyes on how the rates have been impacted by COVID, but all of the statistics that I've looked at that are recent, that are in the past 18 months, say that in all likelihood, that rate is increased because of COVID. There are more churches at risk that we thought maybe 10 to 20 years down the road would be at risk of closing their doors that now perhaps are only a year or two away from closing their doors, statistically speaking. And we can talk at length about, and we have talked at length on this webinar about the growth of the nuns. Now that's a complex category. It's not quite as simple as no faith at all, no faith in God at all, no religiosity at all. Overwhelmingly, the people who self-identify in that category score the importance of religion in their lives as far less statistically. That's a statistic that sociologists have been paying pretty close attention to for about 70 years now. And so the people in the nuns category, even though they might still consider themselves as religious or when they say nothing in particular, the importance of religion in their life tends to be quite low. So that's still an important impact. You put all those statistics together, and here basically is the aggregate of all those statistics. There's about 7 different categories that go into making this up. But sociologists, church historians call this the great decline of religiosity in the United States. So these figures only dated to 2013. This comes from a lecture I presented a few years ago. And so over about a 60-year period, you see that decline. And there's nothing that's happened in the past 9 years that has arrested that decline. If anything, it's increased. So what do you do then? So the picture you're looking at is a picture of a church that actually experienced an earthquake. And you see the damage that an earthquake can cause. But the earthquake that we're experiencing right now in North American Christianity is not by any means the first earthquake that the church, capital C, has experienced, or that the people of God have experienced. I'm going to go all the way back into pre-Christian days to pull in a little bit of information that I have found particularly helpful in the way that I think about this. So we go back to the first earthquake, 586 BC. And if you know your Old Testament history, that's the approximate date of the beginning of the Babylonian exile. So put yourself in the shoes of the people of God. They feel like they have a covenant relationship and that they are God's chosen people, and that the temple is the sign of God's presence in their midst. And yet what happens? The temple, the city of Jerusalem falls. The temple is taken into pagan hands. People are taken into exile, and it's an incredibly disorienting moment for the people of God. But that disorienting moment caused them to do a couple of really interesting things. I wrote a few months ago about the origins of the synagogue. in the history of the Jewish people. There's a wonderful book written by a man named Lee Levine that's the history of the synagogue as an institution. Now, it's pretty dense, and you got to love history to love it in some ways, but it's really, really interesting. And one of the things that really stood out to me about the origins of the synagogue, or the birth of the synagogue as an institution in that moment, was we're not 100% certain that the synagogue in its fullest form came to be during the Babylonian exile. We think that's true. We think at least the initial stages of the life of the synagogue. But what was fascinating to me about reading about the history of the synagogue was that the synagogue, you would think in a lot of ways, would be a place where they would hunker down and circle the wagons, and that they would do everything they could to protect their own particular identity. And certainly as an institution, the synagogue did that. But the other thing that Levine talks about that I think was fascinating was that the birth of the synagogue as a movement de-centered Judaism, that the temple had been a particular way of practicing religion. Temple faith was a particular practice of practicing faith in God. But because synagogues were spread out in various places, there were more than one synagogue, whether there was just one temple, that had the impact of decentering and even democratizing Judaism in some ways, which is really, really interesting. It made it far more egalitarian than it had been prior to that moment. So instead of a command and control structure, a very kind of hierarchical structure, it created a conversation in Jewish life that continued on far after the Babylonian exile was over with. It made it far more participatory. And the thing that was most interesting to me was the synagogue as an institution, in part to demystify who the Jewish people were to outsiders, they made it a very, very open institution, that it was inclusive of the surrounding community. In fact, Levine makes the point, in a lot of ways, the synagogue was more a community center where religious observances took place than a religious place where a few community things took place. The emphasis was on impacting the surrounding community and interacting with the surrounding community, even as it stayed as kind of the central hub for Jewish life amidst the exile. And then it came back, and many of those same traits endured on all the way up to Second Temple Judaism. So another thing, really interesting thing that took place when that earthquake hit was the development of the Hebrew Bible. For an unrelated reason, a couple of years ago, I was doing some research on the development of the Hebrew Bible. And one of the things that just literally jumped off the page to me was just how much of what we know as the Hebrew Bible came into being or was fully developed at about the exact same time. And that time was during and in the immediate aftermath of the Babylonian exile. So you have the completion of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, Micah, Zephaniah. You have the collecting and the editing of the Psalms. You don't have the final versions, but you have strong development of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers during that point, and the initial creation of these prophetic books. What the exile caused the Jewish people to do was they wanted to maintain their identity. They wanted to have a sense of who they were. And so they took their oral tradition and they turned it into a written tradition so that their children and their children's children would continue to have a sense of identity. And yet, here we are centuries later being blessed by the hard creative work that our Jewish brothers and sisters did during the experience of and in the immediate aftermath of one of the hardest points in Jewish history, which is the Babylonian exile. And I think that suggests something to us. All right, now file that away. We're gonna fast forward about 1,000 years into the future. And I would give a gold star if I could for anybody who could tell me what this particular date represents. We don't have time for me to stop and take a poll, so I'll go ahead and give you the answer. That's basically when we don't just like we don't have a definitive date of the beginning of the synagogue, we don't have a definitive date of the origins of the monastery. But looking back in church history, what we see at about that moment is the development of monasticism. Now, it had some older antecedents in the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers that go back before this, but as an organized movement, and I'm tracing that to Benedictine spirituality, that's basically the date that we would put on it. So what you've had happened in this moment is you've had the church go from a house church movement that is very organic, very ground up, to, in the aftermath of the councils, it has been, as a good Baptist, I would say, co-opted by Rome. We had the Constantinian moment in the church, and the church begins to be far more Roman, far more structured, far more command and control in a lot of ways, far more culturally acceptable, and according to the monastics at least, far more worldly than it had been in the first 3 centuries. And so what began to happen was there was this desire for the church to experience renewal, and they didn't think it was going to happen in the traditional forms of the church. And so groups of people would go out and they would live in community, and they would have life centered on prayer. And then Benedictine spirituality added a much deeper and richer rhythm of life to that. Now, the interesting thing is, initially, when the monastic movement started, it was pretty much ignored by the powers that be in the church until it began to become somewhat popular. And these movements began to pop up all over the place. And then it was viewed with a tremendous amount of skepticism, because here was this alternative religious embodiment, if you will, to the institutional church. And so you see a lot of writings in that period of whether or not these monastic communities were going to play nice with the institution or not. Over time, they worked out those agreements. They worked out the question of subordination to the bishop, but it took a while. In the meantime, though, monasticism became, for the better part of 1,000 years, the source of the renewal movement in the church. It took a lot of different forms as different monastic movements came about over time. Oftentimes you have one particular order come into being and they would get really successful, and then they would get kind of worldly, and then another order would come up as kind of a response to the original order. And that happens all the way up to the Protestant Reformation, which I'll talk about in a moment. Tremendous emphasis on education, tremendous emphasis on discipleship, and this kind of constant model that was being offered into the church of what deep spiritual vitality might look like. So, all right, we're going to fast forward another 1,000 years into the future, and you probably, almost everybody can give me the dates on this one. 1517 is the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Just like the monastic movement was a response to the kind of the worldliness of the early church, or the 4th, 5th, 6th century church, Protestant Reformation in a lot of ways is a response to the worldliness of the late medieval church. And we get a lot of things out of it. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, because my assumption is almost everybody on this call knows a fair amount about the Protestant Reformation. But what you see in this is, obviously sola scriptura is a big emphasis there. It's in some ways it's a reaction to the monastic Christianity being the best version of Christianity, and it was a democratization of deep and serious faith for every person organized around Scripture in a lot of ways. Priesthood of the believer is the embodiment of that, and the translation of Scripture and the practice of worship into common language. Out of that, a generation later, come the Puritans and the Pietists, who kind of react to the kind of theological formalism of Lutheranism and Calvinism in some ways. And you can make a really good case that the forms of spirituality that began to emerge out of the Protestant Reformation really continue up into this day, with one more movement that I want to talk about. The last kind of renewal movement that I want to talk about is revivalism. Now, I did my doctoral work in this area. And just like the other movements have been a response to the worldliness of the church, revivalism in a lot of ways started off in that way. The critiques that people like Wesley and George Whitefield were offering, often directed at their fellow ministers, were, we have unconverted ministers. That was the insult that they would use. That was the critique that they would offer. And so in some ways it was hypercritical of the existing church. It put a tremendous emphasis on religious experience. It put a tremendous emphasis on the experience of conversion. Eventually, it came to focus on evangelism. It didn't start off that way. People forget that revivalism actually started as a movement more significantly in Calvinist circles than it, with the exception of Wesley. But over time, in its American form, it became to be strongly focused on individual religious experience and the experience of conversion. And what it did was it was a populist movement. It made religious faith very, very deep, passionate religious faith very, very accessible to the common person, because their experience is what they were using to determine whether or not they were experiencing the presence of God in their lives. So all of these things, all of these renewal movements in the history of the church, and those aren't all of them, those are just some of the highlights, but all of those things tend to have a few things in common. And I want to finish up with this. First, in every case, each one of those movements, from the development of the synagogue all the way up to the birth of revivalism, in some ways began as a response to crisis. What you were reading in the 1790s before the beginning of the Second Great Awakening was the real sense of the God, that the power of God had left. Not that God had left the people, but the people weren't experiencing the power of God, and they were worried about that, worried about what that meant for them. And so as a result of that, a lot of people spent time in prayer in the 1790s, hoping and praying that God would once again revive God's church. Another thing that tends to happen in renewal movements is they almost always begin at the edge of the church, not in the middle of the church, not in the established institutions of the church, but over on the margins in some ways. Now, you could make a case that the synagogues might be one exception to that, but monasticism and the Protestant Reformation and revivalism all were successful in large measure because they started not in the center, but they started at the edge. Another thing that's really important to understand is that in every case, what made the sense of renewal possible was there was an increased sense of spiritual vitality. And the way I define that is the experience of the presence of God in people, in the forms and habits and practices that people are carrying out religiously. That there's something about those things that they were doing that made God more real and more accessible to them. Without that increased sense of spiritual vitality, there have been a lot of moments when people have offered a prophetic critique of the church in history, but they become movements when the experience of it takes on flesh in some ways. Because of that, they tend to be somewhat populist in a lot of ways. If they don't engage a broad number of people, again, you can see some really important and useful critiques of the church over 2,000 years of Christian history, but the ones that become renewal movements are ones that catch on among a broader sense of the people. As a result of that, the endurance tends to be not based on their ideology, but on their productivity. What made the Protestant Reformation so very successful wasn't just that Luther had a theology that offered a critique to the Catholic Church. It was that Luther got busy creating things, writing things, creating new practices and habits. In revivalism, one of the biggest things that emerges out of revivalism is a whole new way of doing worship, a whole new way of singing songs that emerged during revivalism. And singing was by its nature very democratic and very populist, and made it possible for people to experience worship in a new and different way. So all of those things are things that tend to take critiques and turn them into movements. It's populist, it's more focused on productivity than ideology, increased spirituality, and that it begins at the edges. So I told you that last week I spent some time in Yellowstone, and one of the things, we had a guided tour one day by a man who's actually a ranger in the park. And he on his off day, he took us around and was showing us various aspects of the park. And he talked about the most common tree that you'll find in Yellowstone. And the most common tree you'll find, it's about, from memory, it's about 75% of the trees in Yellowstone are lodgepole pines. And lodgepole pines have a distinctive characteristic. They actually have, unlike most pine trees, they have two different kinds of pine cones. Every year they will shed most of their pine cones, but one kind of pine cone is called the serotinous pine cone. And a serotinous pine cone will only open up and spread its seeds in the aftermath of a fire. They have annual pine cones that drop every year, but there's a particular kind of pine cone that is literally designed by nature to only open in the aftermath of a fire coming through. And when that happens, that ground clearance actually makes the environment perfect for the growth of lodgepole pines. That's why they're the most common tree you'll find in Yellowstone. And I sat thinking about that particular metaphor in light of kind of what we're experiencing in a lot of ways in the church right now. And that is I want to pose this question to you. What are those things in the life of the church or in the life of your church that are maybe the habits and practices that God has created and given to us, that in moments like these, when things are difficult, when we find ourselves in the midst of very challenging circumstances, that those habits and practices and ways of doing things that are specifically prepared for this kind of moment? What are the serotinous pine cones for the church that we might look to and try to figure out ways to help those things make their way to the soil and to regerminate and to renew the church in the midst of these moments, the season in which we find ourselves? All right, that's my pitch, and I'm sticking to it. Deborah, I'll turn the baton back over to you.
Thank you. I urge you, there we go. I was going to say I couldn't see all of you with the PowerPoint still up there. Please, as always, throw your questions in the chat and I'll bring them up. Jim is wanting us to recognize the wonderful bristlecone pines of Southern California in that same category. Matt, as many times when I listen to a piece of church history coming alive in the way that you've done so beautifully for us, you come across several times where you want to say that'll preach, and the serotinous pine, that'll preach. There are a couple of different points that you made that sort of threw questions to me. And I'm going to start with one of, here we sit, you ask, what is the impact that this has in the terms of the signs of serotinous pines today for us? We sit with a cognitive mentality of being post-Christendom. The different movements that you were talking about before didn't have a consciousness of that, I don't think. Yeah. I can't say they had a consciousness of crisis, perhaps, but of the high level of secularization and being post-Christendom is a challenge that faces us. And I'm thinking of the fact that living in California, I watch every day around me, even in the populated county that I live in, controlled burns. that are for the purpose of death and resurrection, for the purpose of regrowth. And so that when we watch Mariposa County aflame right now in our state, we know that there's going to be brand new growth out of that, of those, the pines that spread, the ones that have to burn in order to spread and grow again. And that to me is a strong piece of that metaphor of the burning times that we face. And I look at that with another sort of piece of this puzzle is the fringe movements. New Matrix has done a lot of work, Jim Kitchens and I, in what's called positive deviance theory, which is the answer is at the edge. It's an old Peace Corps model, but the notion of it's going to be that fringe that happens. And my own studies as a church historian, I focused on the notion that it takes heresy to create orthodoxy. It's got to be a push or a pull from the edge that's going to get you there. And I look at those pushes and pulls now in our culture and wonder how they might play out and how they fit what we can learn historically about them. The one that I sense right now that is really disturbing to me is an increase in the notion and the thought and the powerful voice behind the notion of theocracy, of us being a Christian nation. How do you see us learning today from where it's rhymed in the past?
I share your concern where that is, and I would tell you, as a student of history, I've made this claim in several circumstances, in several places, and I keep waiting for somebody to offer maybe a counter to what I'm about to say, and I'll challenge everybody on here today. As far as I can tell, in my reading of history, there has never, ever, ever been a renewal movement in the life of the church that has come about by the church trying to utilize cultural control or political power. It's never happened, as far as I can tell, in the history of the church. In fact, back in the first Sunday of July, I preached a sermon. I'm the interim pastor of First Baptist Abilene, and I actually used some statistics to say that in those places where the culture and the church are most strongly, or the government are most strongly intertwined in history, have actually been places where religious observance is at its lowest ebb. So if you look at the place where the greatest amount of tax support for the church in history it was Norway in the latter part of the 20th century. That there were more tax dollars that went to support the Norwegian Lutheran Church than any place in the world. And 97% of people were a part of the Lutheran Church in Norway. And guess what the percentage of people were that were actively engaged in a church? It's 3%.
Yeah.
So those two things don't go together very well. When the church relies on the state to prop it up, that does not tend to foster spiritual renewal in the life of the church. So, so what we say, I think, into this moment is to those who will listen, and I actually think this is where history can help us out a little bit in a non-threatening way. We can say, primarily it's white evangelicals in American culture. We can say to our white evangelical brothers and sisters, and they are our brothers and sisters, history indicates this is not a pathway that is good for the church. The things that you care about are not actually going to happen in the ways that you want them to happen if you continue down this pathway. This is not the pathway to renewal. So
that's great. We're getting a good set of questions here. David, I'm going to start with yours. I loved where you came down in your march through his talk to the point of the final point of the impact of the internet in the 20th century, talking about, Luther, we had the printing press, we had things that coalesced and cross-fertilized to allow for change, and that internet is one of ours. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, same thing happened, by the way, in revivalism too. So part of what happened in American revivalism was you had the growth of newspapers, of religious newspapers, and that the stories that they would tell before those came into being, before those institutions came into being, revivalism would kind of happen locally. But when these papers began to tell the stories, the stories would spread really easily, and it would increase religious fervor. So technology has almost always, changes in technology have almost always aided the spread of religious renewal movements. That certainly happened with the invention of the printing press, that coincided with the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, and writing the Bible in vernacular languages and things like that. The interesting thing in American culture is, you can certainly make a case. We all lived it in the past 2.5 years as the pandemic hit, when 45% of American churches that were streaming online suddenly became about 97% in the span of about 2 months. So we talked on here a lot about what a wonderful example that was of innovation and the church flexing its change muscles. It's probably not fair to say that has sparked anything akin to the Protestant Reformation or the First or Second Great Awakenings yet, but we can still hope. What I will be really interested to see is, I'm going to make a prediction. This is less about observing what's true than about predicting what I think is about to happen. One of the things I think that is about to start happening in the American church is, we talked about mega churches for a long time. I think we're about to start seeing mega churches. This has been true in places like Korea for a while, but technology makes it possible for people to be part of a church in a city where they are not located. A few weeks ago, we had some people from Vernon, Texas, which is about 2.5 hours away from Abilene, who are never in Abilene, who joined the church because of the streaming ministry of First Baptist Abilene. And that's not a particularly good example, because some of the largest churches in the United States have been doing this for a long time. The multi-site phenomenon is the movement in that direction, but the use of the internet and the ability to connect people using technology like Zoom and Skype makes it possible for people to be part of a church and part of a community without being physically present. Some of that worries me a little bit, because I worry it's going to be the consumerism run amok. Everyone goes and looks for their favorite preacher and the music that they like the best. And whether or not they're really deeply connected and deeply engaged in a community virtually, I think is an open question. I'm not somebody that thinks you have to be physically present to be a part of the church. But what I will say is, don't be surprised if 25 years from now, a lot of the mega churches have gone away, because what has happened is the mega churches have been swallowed up by the mega churches. And so we have these giant churches that are denominations unto themselves. And then we have the small community churches that run 200 to 300 on a Sunday morning, that have a very different kind of feel. I wouldn't be surprised. You see that in business. You see the Walmarts and the Amazons of the world. And then you see the mom and pop stores that are very specialized, and they focus on relationships. Oftentimes the church follows after business trends. And in this case, I think that's one that's coming.
Matt, that triggers a question for me that another church historian among us, Diana Butler Bass, is sort of famous for her analogy that saying people used to approach church or community of church through the believe, behave, belong line. And she argues that we have flipped that nowadays, that people come into church life in a belong, behave, believe pattern. I've talked about that a lot in the work that I do with churches around their adaptive changes and their transformation. And I frequently get pushback of folks who say, and that's how we're eroding ourselves, allowing people in the gates, if you will, who are only there for the belong part of it. What's your commentary on that shift and its influence on us?
Well, I say this with a smile on my face. It's part of that's is the Presbyterian circles that you run in. Y'all are better at confessionalism than we Baptists. You have more coherent theology, and so people pay more attention to it. I think that's especially true among younger generations. Mm-hmm. I have seen that in my 20 years of pastoring as well, that oftentimes if you can't get them to belong, then there is no way that you're going to get them to believe and to behave in a particular circle. That the connection is what matters most. A few years ago, in one of the churches I pastored, we started to shift our outreach strategy away from kind of the old model of, okay, we're a church, come and be part of worship, to the community service things that we were doing, because it created a greater sense of belonging, greater sense of connection, more interaction. And we found for younger generations, that was far more likely to give us an opportunity to build relationships than it was to get them to come and sit and be quiet and worship. So anyway, I think she's very right about that. And I think the younger you are, the more that tends to be true.
Well, you've generated a plethora of questions that are going to take us well beyond our timing, but let me bring up this one because I don't know that much about it. So I'm curious. Guy has asked about what you think of the 12-step recovery spirituality as a renewal movement.
So I've been asked this question before, and I think it's a great question. And I am not somebody, I mean, historically, the definition of the church is where the word of God is rightly preached and the sacraments are rightly administered. That's the historic definition of the church. I tend to be a little more permission giving where that is concerned, and say that there are a lot of things that kind of sit alongside the church that I think are forms of church. And I would certainly say that the 12-step program is one of them. That the obvious, limitation on that, and I'm not sure that I think that it ought to be a limitation, I just think that it's perceived as a limitation, is people perceive that as a movement only for a narrow subslice of people, whereas I think the 12 steps, I use it in sermon material a fair amount, actually are really, really useful for all Christians. So I think it has been, Guy, I would say it's very strongly powerful for individuals. I wouldn't say I think it's all the way to the place that it is pouring a widespread amount of spiritual vitality. And I say that not as a critique of it, more as just as much as I can be, an objective observer of the movement. So.
All right. Boy, this is me playing God, choosing which question to go to next. We have a few questions and that play off of Guy's question earlier about, which sort of get to the notion of chicken or egg in terms of culture pushing us and us following it, or us responding and evolving towards a shift in what church is, that is either a reflection of or a cause of. I'm trying to sort of frame a question around this, that the notion of anonymity in the mega church and the mega church is of interest to me in this, because it does, it's the opposite of going from temple to synagogue. It's going from synagogue to mega temple. And the anonymity and the lack of built-in accountability does, I think, lend itself to a growth in consumer Christianity. I'm going to go find the network where I like it best, and I will shift around that. How do you see us working against what that can produce, and in a way that can help the church have a sense of its own accountability, and to fight against what we're experiencing nowadays, which is an incredible tribalism in Protestant American Christianity? We are the personal piety or the social gospel in a new version in our tribalness today.
Yeah, I mean, you put your finger on things that I think are very real problems for the American church in the early 21st century, which in consumerism, I would put very, very high up there as one of the biggest challenges, and often the biggest self-aware challenge that the church faces. And I do think mega churches give themselves to that in a lot of ways. Having said that, I am not anti-megachurch as a movement. I say megachurches, just like small churches, come in good forms and bad forms. I do think the ditch that megachurches tend to fall into is hyper-individualism and consumerism. I think that is a risk that is particularly prevalent in those kinds of places. Having said that, I know some people who served in mega churches that take discipleship in small groups really, really seriously, sometimes in ways that the main line has struggled to do, I think, in some ways. We tend to be pretty heady in the mainline church, where we have good conversation and we get our theology right. And I appreciate that significantly, but it doesn't always have a claim on our interior spirituality, doesn't always have a claim on the habits and practices of how we live, not just the way that we think. And so I think that's the ditch that the main line tends to fall into a little bit. So, what you do with that, I think, is any church, just like we do, has a shadow side that goes along with its strengths. And so one of the things that I guess that I would say is I think every church needs to be self-aware about that, and that's part of why I think the church as a whole needs one another. Like those of us who aren't in mega churches, we need to learn a little bit about how to communicate and how to relate on a broader scale than we tend to. Remember, I said that renewal movements tend to be populist movements. Another thing that the mainline tend to struggle with a little bit is we can be unintentionally elitist, and because we put a lot of stress on the life of the mind. And I don't think that's something we ought to apologize for, but it can make us inaccessible to a lot of people if we're not careful in that way. And that's maybe where the non-denominational world and the evangelical world has something to teach us, just as we have something to teach the non-denominational evangelical world about not being beholden to the spirit of the culture in consumerism in some way. Mm-hmm. So that'd be my answer. And to finish up in this way, to gather up some of the questions that were there, I would differentiate between reform movements and renewal movements. Reform movements are moments when the church needs a corrective. We're doing it the wrong way and we need to do it differently. Those are good. I'm not saying one is good and one is bad, but renewal movements go beyond that. They go beyond doing it the right way to creating increased forms of spiritual vitality in the lives of God's people. And so part of what we have to struggle with in the 21st century is there's some reform that is needed in the church because we have become too beholden to the culture in some ways. There have been ways that we haven't paid attention to certain oppressed groups within the culture. That's reform work that needs doing. So, the way that we have treated women in the church in the 19th and 20th century was in bad need of reform. Still is in need of reform in a lot of ways. And while we need to do that, I would say taking those correctives doesn't necessarily translate into renewal movement. That's something different. It's a distinct part of what the church needs to experience with a different set of rules. So.
Wow. Well, I've overplayed our time today. Matt, I think there's a lot of interest that clearly is showing up in the questions. Can you give us a hint? Because I am ill-informed as to where we go next couple of weeks in this. What are we looking forward to?
We're going to keep going in this way. We're still in the process of pulling our guest panelists together. I've got a couple of big asks out right now that I'm hoping we're going to have. One in particular that I've been wanting to have on for quite some time, but I don't have a definitive yes yet. So just know that if you come back, what you're going to experience over the next few weeks is kind of a deeper dive into particular moments in the life of the church that were renewal movements in the life of the church and what we learned. And historians coming to kind of share their expertise and their knowledge where that is concerned. So.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you those who joined us. There's a lot of meat on the bone going back into history and to seeing how it informs us. With that, we send you off your ways, and we will see you next Thursday.